Hi, my name is Rick Bloodworth. This is the Common Sense Christian channel, and today we're going to be looking at an illustration from one of my favorite authors, the motivational speaker Zig Ziglar. He wrote a book a number of years ago that was a bestseller for a number of years called See You at the Top, and it really had some great advice on how to be a better businessman, a better salesman, and just a better person in general. And within that book, he had a lot of really good illustrations that set across different points he wanted to make. And then he came to one in particular that he said he believed that might be the most important point of the whole book, and used an illustration for that. And so I wanted to look at that illustration today. It involves a person that he refers to as Mr. B. And Mr. B was the president and CEO of a large company, and he called all of his employees together one day, and with this exhortation. He said, "We're just not cutting it." He said, "Our company should be a lot larger than it is, a lot more successful than it is, but we're just not progressing as rapidly as we could." And he said, "I think I know the reason for that. We see a lot of people coming in late, a lot of people leaving for home early, and a lot of people while they're here just not being productive as they could. And starting today, that's going to stop." And he said, "I believe these changes need to be made at the top, so I'm going to try and lead by example. I intend to be here early every day. I intend to go home late every day, and I intend to be prompt on all of my meetings and all of my activities." And so he said, "I expect you to follow that example." And he said, "If my example turns out to be bad, I suspect you'll follow that as well. But I want you to follow the example that I'm going to be setting for you." So went pretty good for 2 or 3 weeks. Everything went along well. People were starting to become more productive until one day he was enjoying lunch with a friend at the country club. And he was so engrossed in his conversation that he lost track of time. And when he looked at his watch, he said, "Oh no, I got to be back at the office in 10 minutes. Well, the office was more than 10 minutes away, so he put his coffee cup down, he ran out to the parking lot, jumped in his car, and he sped back to the office a little too fast because a traffic cop saw him, and he pulled him over, and he gave him a tongue lashing because Mr. B was going 90 miles an hour. And after he gave him the tongue lashing, he gave him a pretty sizable ticket. And so Mr. B is now mad. And he's going back to the office. He's a little bit embarrassed for the example that he's setting and coming back late, but he's also mad at the circumstances. He thinks to himself, "Here I am, a law-abiding citizen. I was driving safe. Sure, I was driving a little bit too fast, but don't the police have something better to do? Don't they have criminals they could be arresting than to pick on law-abiding citizens like me?" So he's worked himself up into a fury, and he comes into the office, and instead of just accepting the fact that he was late, he decides that he will distract from that. And he calls in his sales manager, and he says to the sales manager, "Tell me about the Armstrong account. Have you got it closed yet?" And the sales manager said, "I don't know what happened." He said, "It was going very well, but something did happen, and we've lost the account." Well, now Mr. B is really mad, and he tells that salesman, "I know you've been with me for 18 years, but don't think that means that you have a lifetime of employment. Your job is not secure here. You are going to have to make up for the business that you've lost today by getting new clients." And then he stormed out of the office. He was mad. But if he was mad, it was nothing compared to the sales manager who had just had his ears ripped off for reasons that he thought were not reasonable. And so as he starts thinking about it and thinking about all he's done for the company, he just gets madder and madder. And so he leaves his office and he goes and he finds his secretary and he says, "Have you finished those 5 letters I had for you today?" And she said, "Well, no, don't you remember? You told me that you wanted all my efforts on this particular account, and I've been working on that all day." He said, "That's no excuse. You get these 5 letters done. I know you've been with us for 7 years, but that doesn't mean that you have a lifetime of guaranteed employment. If you don't get these letters done, I'll find somebody who will." And he stormed out of her office. He was mad. Well, now the secretary is mad. And the more she thinks about it, the madder she gets. And she starts thinking about all the important things she does for that company. If people only knew how her boss really was, the very nerve that he would speak to her that way. And she's just now worked up into a fury. And so she goes out to the switchboard where she talks to the receptionist. And she says, "Look, I know this isn't part of your regular job, but you don't have much to do anyway, so I want you to get these 5 letters typed for me today before you go home. And if you can't do it, we'll find somebody who can." She was mad. When she left, the switchboard operator got mad, and she stayed mad. She finished those letters, but she wasn't happy about it. And she just stewed all the way home in her car. And then when she finally got home, what she saw didn't make her any happier, because her 12-year-old son was lounging on the floor watching TV. And then she saw that he had a big rip across the back of his pants. And she blew up at him. She said, "You know I've told you not to be playing in those pants. Those are brand new pants. You just don't have any respect for what I do. I have to make the living. I have to run this household. I have to keep you in food and clothes, and you're just irresponsible." She said, "You can go to bed without your supper, and you can also do without television for 3 weeks." She was mad. Well, she left the room, and as mad as she was, the 12-year-old boy was madder. Just about that time, he sees a cat crossing in front of him. The family cat, and he kicks that cat across the room. He was mad. Well, Zig Ziglar tells this story, and then at the end of the story he asks this question: since the cat was clearly the only one who was not responsible for the events that occurred during that day, wouldn't it have been a lot better if Mr. B had just immediately left the country club, driven straight to the receptionist's house, and kicked the cat? Well, whether this is a true story or one that's just told in parable form, it really makes a good point. And here is the point that he had that he believed was probably the most important of his entire book. He said this: "Your response to negative cat-kicking situations will largely determine your success and happiness in life." Well, think about that for a moment. The way that you handle situations, your response to negative situations, really is going to determine whether you're successful and happy. As a matter of fact, it's also going to determine the way that people see you. So let me ask you this question. When people look at you, what do you think they see? Do they see somebody that's going to fly off the handle, that's going to blow up at them at the slightest thing and give them a hard time for nothing, for no fault of their own? Or do they see you as somebody that's a friend, somebody who really does have their back, who's encouraging? Think about how this situation could have turned out. Let's say Mr. B found himself in that situation and he got the speeding ticket, but before he got back to the office, he was determined to make sure that he let everybody know that while he had made a mistake, and while he'll understand it when they have circumstances like this from time to time, he's still going to try and do his best from this point forward and would appreciate them doing the same. But he didn't do that. Instead of swallowing his pride, he jumped all over somebody that was very important to the success of his organization. And even had he done that, imagine had the sales manager made the determination of, well, I know he didn't have any right to get after me in that way, but he's just had a bad day. And if he had just taken it and not gone after the secretary in such a way, he still could have gone to the secretary and said, "I really need these 5 letters done by the end of the day, and I know that it's my fault that you haven't been able to even get to them, but if there's any way that you could finish these before you leave for the home today, I would really appreciate it." And even if he had not done that, suppose the secretary had calmed down enough to where she could have gone to the receptionist and said to the receptionist, I know this is not your job, and I know you may not have time to do this, but I really need your help. I've got 5 letters to type. Do you think you could take some of them and I'll take some of them, and maybe we could try and do it together? It'd be a really big favor. And even if she hadn't done that, had she blown up like she did, what would it have been like for the receptionist to have gone home and had a normal conversation with her son and found out why he had ripped his pants? And even if proper punishment was needed, to have done it in a proper way. You see, even when we have negative situations, we can still salvage them, and we can still make something good out of them, and we can still treat people decently. I grew up in an era where the coaches thought they were drill sergeants, and maybe there's a reason for that. That was certainly an era that was coming out of a time when most of my coaches either served in World War I or the Korean War, and so they had probably been through their share of drill instructors. Some of them may have even been a sergeant drill instructor at one point or another, but their way of handling their kids, whether it was in gym class or on the team, was by screaming and by yelling and by all sorts of different types of punishment. There wasn't a lot of encouragement. I was probably 13 or 14 years old before I came across my first coach that I really felt like handled things well. And it was right after a move. It was a difficult move because we moved in the middle of a school year, and we had come from Houston, Texas to just outside of Denver, Colorado. Before that time, a few years earlier, I'd played on a soccer team, and my mom thought it'd be a good idea to sign me up for another soccer team, so she did. And so I started in the middle of the year. And so here I am coming up to this soccer team who's already been playing, already been practicing, already has all the positions filled, and I'm kind of an outsider coming in. To compound that, in the past I had played right wing, which was a position for those who were the speediest on the team. And at one time I was kind of tall for my age and slim and was pretty fast. But by the time this had come around, I had stopped growing, but my appetite hadn't. So I was a little bit chunky, and I had lost a step or two. And so when the coach asked me, what position do you play? And I told him right wing, he kind of looked at me and said, okay, well, let's go ahead and run you against our current right wing position player, and we'll see if you've got the speed to do that. And so we ran a race, and by the end of that race, at about 50 yards, that other guy who was a right wing had beat me by about 10 yards. And so now we're walking back to the team. I'm the new kid, and this is a walk of shame because I have just been blown away. I was expecting the team to laugh. I don't know exactly what kind of comments I was expecting, but I was expecting some comments from the coach. Well, this coach had a particular brogue accent. I'm not sure if he was from Scotland or Ireland. I think it was Scotland, but when I came back up to the team and the coach said this. He said, "Aye, he's a winger," which I think translates to mean, yes, he's fast enough to play the position of wing. And so instead of just crushing me and saying, what do you think you're doing trying to play this position? You're the slowest guy on the team. He immediately built me up in front of the eyes of the other kids. And then all the way through practice, he just treated everybody pretty much that way. And at the end of practice, he took me aside and very confidentially said this. He said, I know your position, your natural position is wing, and you do a good job at that. But he said, we have a problem right now where we really need a good fullback. We've got a hole in that position on our team. Do you think there's any way that you might be able to help us out? Well, the way he had treated me, I was willing to do anything that he asked at that point, so sure, I could help him out. Even though the fullback in the big picture of a soccer team is the tortoise, whereas the right wing is the hare. And he was putting me in a slow position, but he was doing it in a very diplomatic and kind way, as if I was doing him some kind of a favor. Well, I remembered that. I've always remembered that. And when I think about this coach, I don't even know if he's still alive. I assume he's probably gone on by this point. But when I think of him, I think of him very highly. When I look at him, if you were to ask me, when I look at him, what do I see? I would have to tell you I see a great, great man. I don't know that he was that fantastic of a coach as far as win-loss successes, but I can tell you he was one of the most, if not the most effective coaches I've ever been around. And I remembered that when I started coaching little kids. I can remember when I started off, I started coaching little boys, and little boys have a particular way of playing and a particular way of interacting. And then I started coaching my daughter's teams, and they act really different. I can remember the first practice I had with the girls, or one of them, and there was one little girl on the team who knew me well. She went to the church where I preached, and I told the team I needed them to do something, and she said, "Yes, sir," real sarcastic like. And I said, "No, I'm serious. I need you to settle down." And she said, "Yes, sir." And I said, "No, you need to settle down." And she said, "Yes, sir." And so I said, "Well, you need to give me a lap." Well, she got up and she ran the lap, but at the end of the lap, she just collapsed in a pool of tears. And then the rest of these little girls, 3rd and 4th grade age, went over and they started patting her. And I'm just standing there with the whistle dropping out of my mouth because my mouth is wide open, trying to figure out what just happened. And at that point, I realized that you have to treat girls differently than you do boys. So I had a team meeting right then and there, and I explained to them, look, there will be times where you'll all run laps. It'll be either because I'm trying to get a certain type of a discipline, or I'm trying to get you in shape for the ball game, but I assure you that we're still friends. And that was all they needed to hear. It was so successful on that after that year, I probably coached at least another 20 teams of girls, and at the beginning of every year I'd start with the same speech and tell them, look, you may have to run laps, you probably all will, but we'll still be friends. And they were good to go from that. I also remember after the ball games, whether we won or lost, the very next practice I would have the girls circle up around me, and I would go over the game with them, and I would tell them what I really liked about what they did, the things that they did really well. And then I would talk to them one by one in front of everybody else, some of the things that I thought they could do to even play better the next game. And then I reminded them how good they did in this game, and I just did that all the way around. And I can remember the looks of those little girls as they would just be sitting in a circle with their eyes just glued to me, drinking in this encouragement. Now, some of the girls came from really good families and they were used to encouragement, but some of the girls that I coached, that was probably the only encouragement that they were likely to hear in any given day. And they really appreciated that. Well, again, it's this understanding of making sure that you are treating people in an encouraging way. I learned that from a good example, and hopefully I was a good example as well. And one of the reasons that we do this is because we really do want to try and figure out what people see when they look at us. Not so that we can be lifted up with pride, but so that we can make sure that we're doing the very best we can for them. Here is one of the main points of this whole talk today. Your attitude is contagious. It's the most contagious thing that you probably have about you. If you come to work with a bad attitude, you're probably going to leave the entire workplace infected. On the other hand, if you come to the workplace upbeat, or to the school upbeat, or to your family upbeat, you're very likely going to leave that whole workplace, that whole school that's been around you, your whole family, in a much better position than they would have been had you not been there, because your good attitude is every bit as contagious as a bad attitude. Let's look at some scriptures that point this out. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, in verse 14, it says, "Encourage the timid, help the weak, be patient with everyone. make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always try to be kind to each other and to everybody else. He's talking to Christians and he's just telling them, you be kind to your fellow Christians, but you also be kind to everybody else. If we can learn to encourage and to be patient and to never pay back wrong for wrong, but to always try to be kind to one another, we're going to be very successful in what we do. And we're going to be very happy, I'm convinced, in what we do. And when you talk about the main goal of the Christian, serving God and being in heaven someday so you can serve Him for all eternity, it becomes very important that we serve Him right and that our life is attractive to others so that we don't push them away, but rather that we draw them in, not so that we can win somebody to a club or something like that, but because everybody is going to be happier if they're a servant of God. God made us that way, and we know this is right. In Romans chapter 12, it says verse 6, it says we all have different gifts. And then in verse 8 he says, if it is encouraging, let him encourage. Well, we all have different aptitudes that God has placed within us. We also have different things that the circumstances of our raising have helped to inculcate within us. And these really are gifts from God. And the Apostle Paul, through inspiration, is just pointing out, if one of your gifts is encouragement, make sure you use it to encourage. Now, we're all commanded to encourage one another. Don't get me wrong on that. But you have to admit there are some people in your life that have done a particularly good job at that. And when you look at them, what you see is a very fine person. And we want people, when they look at us, to see the same thing. We want them to see a true picture of us. But part of that true picture really needs to be one of somebody who loves them and encourages them. It makes everybody's life easier. And then in Hebrews chapter 10, it says, let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds. Let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Well, part of this context is talking about the worship, and so he may be, when he says as you see the day approaching, be talking about the first day of the week. He may be talking about the judgment day, who knows? But the fact is that Christians have an obligation to be encouraging one another, and part of that is in thinking about how we can spur one another on to love and good deeds. Have you ever thought about the reason that God has us worship together? You could sing by yourself, you could pray by yourself, you could read the Bible by yourself, you could even take the Lord's Supper by yourself. You could send your contributions to whoever you wanted to in an envelope to somebody on the other side of the world if you wanted to. But God chose the first day of the week for the church to gather together, to be together. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 42, we see one of the things that the earliest Christians did was they devoted themselves to the fellowship. God knew we needed to be together to encourage one another. It's important that like-minded people get together for that encouragement. It will help us to do much better things for God. It will help our lives to go much easier if we have that proper encouragement. Well, again, I want to stress this point. Your attitude is contagious. Good, bad, or indifferent, people are going to catch that attitude. And the way that people look at you will be determined largely based upon the attitude and the way that you treat them. And if you're encouraging them, and you do it on a regular basis because you love them, not because you're trying to get something out of them, well, when they look at you, what they're going to see is somebody who's very important to them in their life. And somebody who they want to be with more often. When people look at you, what do you think they see? If you're not really proud of what you think they might see, then may I suggest you start doing this. Get a better attitude because it's contagious. And then start doing your best to build each other up and encourage one another. It'll help everybody. And it will make your life much, much happier and you'll be much more successful in the service that God expects you to have while you're here on this earth. Well, that's all for today. I appreciate you tuning in. If you like this, if it's helped you in any way, I'd encourage you just to smash that like button. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't. That'll help this channel get to more people. And so I would really appreciate it if this has helped you, if you wouldn't mind doing those things. Anyway, until next time, I pray that God will richly bless your efforts as you seek to serve Him to the best of your ability.